Hi guys, welcome to another class of Spain facing the 21st century. Today we're going to be talking again about Zapatero's government. However, today's class is going to be very different from the previous one. You can remember the previous one was about Zapatero's leadership, how he got to power, and also about the social policies that he pushed during his two terms, particularly the first one, because actually what we're going to focus on today is what happened in the second term that prevented him from doing anything else. Actually, remember his first term was between 2004 and 2008. So you can more or less imagine, you can anticipate what we're going to be talking about if it starts in 2008. And obviously that's the economic crisis that hit the whole world. And actually you will see today and also next week how it hit Spain even more than other countries. And for some reasons that we're going to be talking about today. The first half of the class, we're going to be talking about the impact of the economic crisis. We're going to see some of the figures that actually are related to the first term to the second term of Zapatero. You will see between 2008 and 2011. And then we're going to talk about the economic policy of Zapatero. So actually the economic policy is mainly focused on tackling the economic crisis. So let's get into it. Well, the beginning of the crisis is something that you probably are familiar with, 2008. Before that, we were in 2007, we were more or less anticipating what it was about to happen. But by the end of the day, the global financial crisis was a credit crisis, loss of trust in the global markets, also related to raw materials. And on the other hand, it was also a housing crisis because by the end of the day, people were defaulting and banks were piling a stock of houses that they could not translate into money, so to say, transform into money. And actually, banks were collapsing because they had all these toxic assets and they had no liquid money by the end of the day. I mean, that's a very long story short, but more or less gives you an image. And these obviously got to Spain, and you will see that actually this was a big problem for Spain. Why? Because we had some structural weaknesses to tackle these economic crisis. First thing is that their housing sector was in the middle of a bubble. I mean, and this is if you study economic bubbles, then this is actually for sure the perfect example. You see how prices were growing in Spain. House prices were growing almost over 20% a year in Spain. That's unsustainable. There's no reason behind that. People were just speculating. They were buying second properties either to profit from them or in a second vacation house whatsoever. But by the end of the day, as the prices were growing 20-30%, you could pretty much finance the house with the rise in the price of it. I mean, by the end of the day, the year after, even if you owe the bank 100,000 euros, next year was going to be worth 120,000. So by the end of the day, you had to make good business then. So, I mean, this also resulted in more houses being built. And you can see that how over 500,000 houses were being built every year. And that for a country that has 47 million people, inhabitants, it's no absolute nonsense. That's pretty much everyone's changing houses relatively often. So that's a big problem. We had a stockpile of houses that was massive people getting in debt to buy second properties. And also, this is something we were already mentioning in class, we have a precarious job market. On the one hand, we have what this graph shows is a temporary jobs in Spain that actually before the crisis 2005 2006 2007 were over 30%. That's a very high rate if you compare it to other countries. You can compare it there in the graph with the European Union average, and obviously you can see almost a perfect match between these temporary jobs and the jobs being destructed and the unemployment rate at that time. Here you can see how these jobs are destroyed, these are the people that normally get unemployed. So there's a strong correlation there between these two factors. And on the other hand, where we can see how precarious the job market was how it was distributed, in which sectors it was. By the end of the day, Spain is a country that relies heavily on services, particularly in these services. These services do not have much added value, and we're talking here about tourism. We're talking about any activity that is related to that kind of economic activity. We're also talking restaurants. We're talking jobs that can be destroyed very easily, and also housing was a strong. I mean, 10% of people being employed in housing That's a very big share of the population. We're talking about almost 5 million people. Well, not 5 million people. We're talking, I think it was around 3 million people at that time. But by the end of the day, we did have a lot of people working in construction. You see that is a market that was about to be affected by the economic crisis in 2008. What indicators do we have of the crisis? How did the crisis took place in Spain? How can we read what happened in Spain? But first thing, we can look at unemployment. Unemployment, you already know that actually employment figures go up and down very rapidly in Spain. We create and destroy jobs very easily. Why? Because they are these temporary jobs. They are precarious jobs. It's easy to dismiss, but it's also easy to hire. There's very little risk in that sense. Well, at least now there is. Back in the past, there was less, but at the end of the day, our market is very elastic. We get to, I mean, if we go back to 94, you remember González government, it got to 24%. But and at that point, before the crisis, we at that time we were in our record best unemployment figure, that 7.95. Remember that Spain still has a very high base. Why? Because of all these black market employments. I mean, all these illegal economy jobs. And we see how already 2007 starts growing. So we see some signs. And with the economic crisis, we see these skyrockets. I mean, here I only have the graph up until 2011. And next week, we're going to be talking about the second half of the crisis and how we got out of it, when we talk about the Mariano Rajoy government. But yeah, at this point, Zapatero left office in 2011 with 22.85% unemployment. That's incredible. That's amazing. He always has a record for highest and lowest unemployment rate during his term. Not only the lowest, but almost the highest as well. You will see that this kept growing after he left office. But we see how in a very short period of time we destroyed a massive number of jobs. I mean, actually something very similar to what is happening right now. Actually, later in the course, we're going to be talking about Spain nowadays and what is going on. And I think it's very interesting also to talk about the mechanisms that the government is putting in place to save employment. But don't worry, I mean, that's something for another class today. I'm going to focus on the economic crisis. What other indicators we have that clearly show what happened in Spain? GDP. I mean, we see how from growing at a 4.1 yearly, we go in less than a year to our economy to be destroyed 4% a year. That's massive. Here we see how the economy was kind of recovering in 2010, but then 2011 again we fell short. And by the end of the day, the GDP shows pretty well what was happening with the activity, and obviously is a GDP that translates in unemployment. Another important thing is public debt. Public debt in Spain at that time was controlled. Actually, for the first time in quite a long time, we'll see it in a second, we had superávit. But by the end of the day, Spain was more and more in debt. And you can see how during the economic crisis, public debt grew because by the end of the day, the state, the government was not collecting enough money through taxes because less people were working. And on the other hand, it had to give more money to all these benefits for unemployed people, but on the other hand, also to finance itself in the debt, in the bonds market. But we'll get to that in a second. And you see how it grew, Spanish public debt. If we talked in American terms, it got to 1 trillion euros in 2014. And quite likely it's going to keep growing. I mean, and right now we are in a higher percentage of the GDP right now. We deposited 40% of GDP, which was a great figure, but by the end of the day, I mean, 40% public debt, it's a good figure, but it went wrong. And by the end of the day, this is a large picture with public debt, but we can also look at public deficit, how much money, whether the finances of the state every year are saving money or spending more than we have. And before the economic crisis, we were saving a little bit more than we were spending less than we were collecting, so to say. But from 2008, you see that completely changed the trend. By the end of the day, the state needs to support these people that were in need, and it was necessary. Over 10% of public deficit is massive, and Spain has been trying to control the public deficit since. It seemed that right now we were kind of on the correct path, but once again, this is going to go out of hands. And last thing that I'm going to tell you about economic crisis indicators, or you can tell more or less the dimension of the crisis in Spain, was the risk premium, prima de riesgo. In Spain, we calculate this risk premium compared to the German bond, so Spanish bond compared to the differential between Spanish bonds and German bonds. Don't worry too much about the technicalities, but you see how it grew, and this meant that it was more expensive for Spain to borrow money in the financial markets. By the end of the day, anyone buying Spanish public debt was getting more interest because it was more risky. It was more likely that Spain could default than Germany, for example. And that was due to the weakness of the economy by the end of the day. So this also tells a story of how, this by the end of the day tells a whole story of the dimension of the crisis in Spain. Just look at that figure, 22% unemployment, that's massive. That's almost, I mean, at that point, it got more in 2011, but that's 1 out of every 4 Spaniards that were seeking for a job not finding it. And that's absolutely problematic. This was a massive crisis in Spain. And obviously that had political implications, but we'll see it in a second. Now we're going to have a break. After that, we're going to talk about the 2008 elections and what happened with the economic policy of Zapatero from that point. So see you in a minute.